Okay, so another type of theory on business cycles, why does labor demand decrease, is what we call Keynesian theory. Now, Keynesian theory comes from an economist with the last name of Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, who really was most active or most cited in and around the period of the Great Depression, which we talked about before. He's kind of credited with a lot of the ideas in economics that came out of that era and is still having a very long-lasting impact. And so what did the Keynesian ideas, what do they focus on? Are really more changes in what I would call demand or aggregate demand. And the key part here is that these aren't driven in particular by any fundamentals of the economy. So in some sense, very close to what real business cycle theory hypothesized, is that our capital and labor availability doesn't in particular change, but the technology ability to combine those changes. And you could think of there, in that sense, technology as a fundamental of the economy, right? And Keynes is saying that none of that is changing here, but rather what he calls animal spirits, which are some perceptions or sentiments about how the economy is going. So what animal spirits are sentiments about economy in general. And so his idea was that a recession is driven by pessimism. So for whatever reason, I am all of a sudden very negative about life, about the economy in particular. So both consumers and firms are negative. And the key part then is that they spend less. So consumers all of a sudden don't want to buy stuff, and firms don't want to invest. So consumption and investment go way down, and that causes a big decrease in demand, which is what decreases labor demand. Firms don't want to hire as many workers because people aren't buying as much stuff. And that is the fundamental aspect of the Keynesian theory. So the marginal product of labor is decreasing simply because people don't want to buy things. And the reason they don't want to buy things is because they're pessimistic about the future. And that causes them to buy less. And, in a lot of ways, very similar to how I said that the current coronavirus pandemic could be viewed as a technology shock, it could very easily also be viewed as an animal spirit, as pessimism, right? So all of a sudden, whether or not the risk is significant or not, people don't want to go out and shop. They don't want to go to restaurants. Well, I mean, we can't technically right now, but even without those restrictions, it's not clear how many people would go to restaurants, would go to stores and interact with other people because they are negative. They are pessimistic about these activities. And so, that may or may not be driven by fundamentals, and it could be considered an animal spirit. And so part of what was true in this Keynesian theory is that because it's not driven by fundamentals, we could stay in a state of pessimism for a very long time. And so that's really what makes these two theories, real business cycle theory and Keynesian theory, different. You could kind of view them as the same thing, right? We've got capital and labor, but all of a sudden we can't produce as much. So whether I call A technology or I call it pessimism or animal spirits doesn't in particular matter. But what does matter is that in the real business cycle theory, that process is going to work itself out, right? So if the economy is reshuffling itself around, eventually I'm going to work that out and we're going to go back towards economic growth. So the real business cycle theory is more positive about these temporary blips in activity are short-lived and the economy goes back to a path of growth. Keynesian theory suggests that these periods of recession could potentially last for much longer, right? So the wave of pessimism doesn't go away and the economy stays in a recession, and that could potentially last forever in theory. And so that's the main difference between the two, right? RBC, real business cycle theory, says we'll eventually get back. Keynesian theory says we may not. And so the key part of where that gained popularity is that it really places a role on activist policy from the government and the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve and the government play a big role. So in the next chapter, after we finish up this chapter, we're going to go into these policies and we'll see how they work. And the efficacy of these policies and whether or not they're beneficial or not depends heavily on which view I take, real business cycle theory or Keynesian theory. All right, so the next one, I'll come back to here, is multipliers in the Keynesian theory and get a sense of how these work. And then we'll talk about one more theory of business cycles, which is kind of a related but a mix of the two.